I did want to talk about the $20 billion, $20.6 billion for Ukraine that Biden is trying to allocate in the next funding bill. Let's read a little bit of this article, because this might become a partisan fight that you see in the bleachers of Congress. It's most likely going to go through. Majority of Republicans still support aid to Ukraine when we're talking about elected Republicans, and the vast majority of Democrats support aid to Ukraine, including the base and both the base and the party proper. Let's read a little bit about this. President Biden on Thursday asked Congress to approve $20.6 billion in additional funding for Ukraine as the country's military struggles to achieve a decisive victory in its counteroffensive against Russia. In a letter to lawmakers, the White House Office of Management and Budget asked for $13 billion in new military aid and $8.5 billion in additional economic, humanitarian, security assistance for Ukraine and other countries affected by the war. And so if we have a little bit over $40 billion already sent in military aid, adding $13 billion, that means we would be over $50 billion in total for military aid after these shipments. Now, not all of that aid has reached Ukraine. I want to emphasize that, because when people talk about the numbers in sending of weapons to Ukraine, a lot of the numbers aren't included. A lot of times people will say 200,000 and they'll think we've sent 200,000 in aid to Ukraine, even though that number is just completely bogus. We've sent around $42 billion in military aid. Now we're trying to add another $13 billion to that. Of our military budget, it makes up about 3% of our military budget. Of our GDP, it makes up about 0.3% of our GDP, and as a percentage of our GDP, we're like the 8th or 9th country to supply Ukraine the most out of a percentage of our GDP. In total, because of our size and strength and amount of military assets we have, we've sent more than any other country. But as a percentage of GDP, we're in like 7th place, behind Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the United Kingdom, Poland, and I think 1 or 2 other countries. The funding request also includes other forms of assistance for Ukraine. The White House is also seeking more than $12 billion for disaster relief and other emergency domestic funds, including hurricanes, as well as tens of millions of dollars to boost pay for firefighters on the front lines of the wildfires that have hit many parts of the country. In total, Biden is asking Congress for about $40 billion in new spending. The funding tied to the war in Ukraine, now nearing its 18th month, is likely to prove the most controversial item. The United States, I don't know, man. You ask the Republicans about paying the firefighters more. I want to see what they say about that. The United States has already directed more than $60 billion in aid to Ukraine, but that's both in humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine, including more than $40 billion in direct military assistance. This is more than any other country. Biden has vowed, again, in total, but not as a percentage of GDP. As a percentage of GDP, I mean, for us, it's like 0.3% of our GDP. For Estonia, it's like 1.3%. That is more than any other country. Biden has vowed that the U.S. government will support Ukraine as long as it takes, based. But Western allies face difficult questions about the state of the war effort, with Ukrainian forces bogged down in the east despite new weapons and training from the west. The administration is requesting supplemental security, economic, and humanitarian assistance funding that would support Ukraine. As well, by the way, if we're going to talk about Ukraine being bogged down in its counteroffensive in Zaporozhye, we should include why they're bogged down. Right? I know a lot of Western commentators are saying, oh, it's because of a lack of brilliance in combined arms warfare. But I would like to see American soldiers try to conduct a counteroffensive without air superiority. Not only without air superiority, but when the other side has more control of the air than you do. Into well-fortified positions with multiple layers that are only being attacked now because it took so long for Western tank shipments and Western armor shipments to get to Ukraine. And maybe if we shipped these things earlier, they could have got the counteroffensive started 4, 5, 6 months earlier, when they didn't have another 4, 5, 6 months of trench building and dragon teeth placing and mine placing and entrenchment building. But whatever. The administration is requesting supplemental security, economic, and humanitarian assistance funding that would support Ukraine, as well as countries and vulnerable properties worldwide impacted by Russia's unprovoked, brutal invasion of Ukraine. The Senate leaders of both parties are expected to support the president's request. Some scores of far-right members in the House of Representatives made it clear they would oppose any new funding to Ukraine. Wow. but a large majority of Republicans still want to ensure that some money is sent to Ukraine and NATO allies, particularly ahead of a blistering winter that could slow the counteroffensive even more. What you hear from lawmakers is yes, we should. By the way, if you look at all my ads recently, it's all ads for like helmets, body armor. Gosh, they know their markets, huh? What you hear from lawmakers is, yeah, we should support this. But there are some already saying no, and some saying this can't go on forever, which is a reflection of the American public. Ukraine's government faces a budget deficit of about $40 billion for this year, but it is likely to be covered by aid from Europe, the United States, and other organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, according to Oleg Osenko, an economic advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. But that does not resolve what Ukrainians will do to make up the deficit next year should the war continue. And tens of billions of dollars in damage to critical infrastructure has gone unrepaired, including for Ukraine's electrical grid and hospitals. The World Bank has estimated that the rebuilding of Ukraine will cost as much as $350 billion. Man. So let me go to the end here, because the ending here is, I think, the important part. It is unclear how the House will handle the Ukraine funding request. The GOP-controlled chamber is already bracing for a major fight over the government spending when Congress returns in September, as far-right members continue to push for significant budget cuts. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy vowed in June that he would not support any supplemental funding, saying aid for Ukraine should go through the regular appropriations process. I don't know how much he's going to stick to this, though. I really don't know how much he's going to stick to this, because on one hand, I don't think Kevin McCarthy particularly opposes aid to Ukraine. And if you look at how most of his colleagues or his long-term colleagues view it, they want to support aid to Ukraine. I think that this might be tough rhetoric because he has a very slim House majority. But then again, if those in his House majority, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or say Lauren Boebert or Matt Gaetz, are willing to call a vote over his leadership, which is something that he included, that if he was going to become House Speaker, he made an agreement with these radicals in his party that they could do a recall vote on him as leader at any point. I could see one of these renegade far-right maniacs, and this is what happens when you allow the crazies in your party to dominate it, because you've got a very slim majority, and you got to do what's necessary to keep the coalition together. You got to make whatever deals necessary to get them involved. But when you allow these crazies to run the party, I could easily see Lauren Boebert saying, recall vote, or Matt Gaetz saying, recall vote. Let's do a recall vote on Kevin McCarthy over funding requests to Ukraine if he tries to allow it to go through. So I could see these radicals who don't represent the majority of the people on Capitol Hill, don't represent the majority of elected Republicans, don't represent the majority of Democrats. I don't even think it represents the majority of Americans. But these radicals are going to try to derail funding any way possible. And we need to be ready for it, which is why next week, next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I don't think I announced this on Twitter yet. I don't think I've announced this anywhere. I'm going to be bringing on Libertarian gubernatorial candidate Larry Sharp this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific, 2 a.m. here in Kiev. We're going to be bringing him on to discuss the war in Ukraine. He kind of reached out to me out of the blue, saying how we need to end support and aid to Ukraine. And I disagree with him, and I offered him to come on the show and that we could just talk about our disagreements. And with the recent polling data from CNN showing that now it's 50-50 on whether we should continue to send more aid to Ukraine. 50-50 of Americans. I believe we need to engage in more of these conversations so we can go out there and do our best to convince people to counter these arguments. Not to mention, data seems to show that the more informed people are about the war, when they hear that it's only 3% of our GDP that we've spent on the war, when they hear that we have only spent about, not 3% of our GDP, but 3% of our military spending and 0.3% of our GDP, when they hear about our other allies also sending support, the majority of Americans support Ukraine. When they hear about the liberation of Kharkiv and Kherson, the majority of Americans want to continue to send aid to Ukraine. An informed voter when the voting populace is informed about what is going on in Ukraine, they still overwhelmingly support aid to Ukraine. We're talking 65, 70 to 75%. It is the disinformation that has been spread by people like Tucker Carlson, RFK, Russian propaganda, and other liars that have deceived Americans into thinking, oh, for every single Russian that dies, 7 Ukrainians have died. Russian propaganda, complete disinformation that's made its way onto the #1 show in cable news in the United States, Tucker Carlson's program. That's why we need to engage in these dialogues, so we can make sure that aid and support to Ukraine like this goes through smoothly, and we don't have a few radicals derailing the whole party. Obviously, we can't convince those radicals. They're set against aid for Ukraine. Maybe they have sympathies for the Russians because of their social values, their reactionary social values. Maybe they're just true isolationists at heart. Maybe they're using Ukraine as a scapegoat. And from conversations that have been reported back to me with Republican legislators in the House, some of it honestly is the cynical use of Ukraine, thinking, it's too toxic. They might know that it's valuable to support Ukraine. It's a good idea to support Ukraine, but they oppose aid to Ukraine simply because it's a toxic political issue. And they're using it cynically for their short-term political gain. This is why we need to push on this issue more. It should be politically taboo to even associate with the people trying to stop aid to Ukraine. That is the type of political consensus I would like to develop in the United States. A Republican-led House will not rubber stamp any blank check funding requests, a McCarthy spokesman said. Rather, the administration's emergency funding requests must be reviewed and scrutinized on their merits consistent with the practice and principles of our majority, said Kevin McCarthy. Asking to tack on Ukraine funding to a must-pass funding bill would probably only inflame the House Freedom Caucus and its allies further. And they've already expressed a willingness to shut down the government in pursuit of spending cuts. Republicans can only lose 4 lawmakers within their ranks to pass legislation through their slim majority without Democratic help. 2 people familiar with the current thinking among Republican members of the Appropriation Committee, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss legislative strategy, think that the supplemental request would best be tacked on to another must-pass item, the yearly food insurance reauthorization program, which could put pressure on Republicans to go along with it rather than deny aid to states affected by disasters this summer. I do want to make one note, and this isn't said enough, and I do want to make a point of this. We are supporting a nation fighting for its democracy tooth and nail, fighting for its national survival tooth and nail. We have the majority of the population on our side, and what we're supporting is a good, morally righteous struggle for liberation. The Democrats overwhelmingly support it. Every single Democrat in the House support our support for Ukraine. That is not the consensus within the Republican Party, and that is certainly not the consensus amongst the base of the Republican Party. There is something to be said about the fact that the Republican Party led us head first into the war in Iraq, a war based on lies and deceit, calling everyone who didn't want to support it un-American, going after them hard. For a war where the locals would reject us during the occupation period, we'd spend trillions with very little gain. Is Iraq today better than Iraq under Saddam? Yes, but what was the price to get there? And as far as I remember, it was based on weapons of mass destruction. That was the reason why we went in. Now we've got a war that isn't based on lies, where the local population supports us and supports us overwhelmingly, where the local population is making it very clear that they will fight tooth and nail for the protection of democratic values, and we're spending like 1/20th or 1/10 the costs of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. Even more so if you combine the two. For much more benefit with less risk to American personnel. And the Republicans are jumping ship. Some of them due to just isolationism, but others due to the more cynical behavior, like Ron DeSantis, where he's saying it's not America's core national security interests. But while he's saying it's not America's core national security interests to defend Ukraine, he proposes bombing Mexico to attack their drugs, to attack the drug trade. Apparently that is a core national security interest, is to illegally intervene in Mexico and bomb its country without the permission of the Mexican government. That will totally not destabilize the country, and that will totally earn the favor of the Mexican people. It feels like no matter what we do, man, there's always going to be some section within the Republican Party that takes our foreign policy and says, no. We shouldn't be using our resources for this good thing. We should be using it for the most barbaric and horrific thing you could possibly imagine. Oh, I did want to talk about the rocket strikes on Zaporozhye. I thought I should probably talk about it. Okay, so another day, another Russian terror bombing. The most recent one was on a hotel in Zaporozhye that was frequented by UN staff, foreign journalists, etc. The Russian cruise missile hit the hotel, and it has already been condemned by UN representatives. Let's read a little bit about it, and then I'll show you a video of the incident, which is quite horrifying. Denise Brown, the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine, issued a statement condemning the Russian military's August 10th attack on the city of Zaporizhia. The missile strike, which killed one person and injured 16 others, damaged the Reichskarts Hotel on the Dnieper River. The hotel was often used by UN staff and NGO workers. Brown said she was appalled by the attack, calling the strike unacceptable. The number of indiscriminate strikes that have damaged civilian infrastructure and killed and injured civilians has reached an incredible level, Brown said, and they are in violation of international humanitarian law. Brown said that the Reichskarts Hotel served as a hub for UN humanitarian aid workers in the city. The UN used the hotel as a base for civilian evacuations of Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol in May of 2022. The attack on the hotel was the second deadliest missile strike on Zaporozhye in 2 days. 3 people were killed in August 9th after an attack. Brown called for Russia to immediately cease this indiscriminate attacks on Ukraine. Now, the video of this is actually very terrifying. So as you can see in the distance here, there is smoke rising from there already being a missile strike, but a second missile is about to come in. And what you're about to hear on camera is a father consoling his 2 children who he took to walk at this park, because what you see here is a public park in Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is a very beautiful city and area, by the way. I've been there multiple times. A very lovely place. A lot of beautiful countryside over there. A lot of beautiful nature. But he says to his child, "Oh God, another rocket. Calm down. Don't cry." Let's play the video.
Ребята, только что на наших глазах. Мы здесь на набережной стоим. На Радуге свист. Ракета летит. И в Рейкерс. Во имя Иисуса Христа. Боже! Ракета! Во имя Иисуса. Это Роман Алайдис. Смотрите, что происходит. Тихо, все. Не плачьте. Рабадала. Смотрите, что происходит. Стой.
One of the first interviews I ever did was before I even got into Ukraine, but one of the first interviews I ever did surrounding this war was an interview with the headmistress of a Polish school for very young children. Like, we're talking like kindergarten age, preschool age. That's the age group we're talking about. And I was trying to talk to them about the Ukrainian children that they had accepted into the school, because they had accepted multiple displaced Ukrainian children into the school so they can have some sort of basic education, and the costs of their admission had been covered by other locals. It was very sweet. It was a very sweet charity for these children. And we went outside to look at the Ukrainian children playing, and I asked them while we were watching the Ukrainian children play, and they were playing with the Polish children, they were all playing together. And I asked them about if there was any, psychological problems that the Ukrainian children had to face. Because, a child living through war is not simple. It's not easy. It comes with a lot of challenges, definitely a lot of psychological challenges. And she turned to me and she said, you can only tell the Ukrainian Polish children apart during playtime through one way, because they're usually all running around together playing. They all play together. She was constantly emphasizing to me how they all play together and they all got along, because there's a lot of history of racism, bigotry, and violence between Polish and Ukrainian people. But she said the way you can tell the difference between the Polish child and the Ukrainian child is when a plane from the local Lublin airport, we were in Lublin, Poland, passes overhead. There's an airport very close to the school. You see, there is no civilian planes in Ukraine. There used to be before the war, but when the war started, all civilian planes were grounded. All civilian planes were grounded. So anytime a plane passed overhead, it could only be a military aircraft. And so that's why that one time when I was on stream, when I heard that engine that sounded like a jet engine, the first thing I did was got down. Now, of course, it being a Russian jet that close to Kiev was unlikely, but that was the case. It turned out to be a missile. But there are only military jets in the sky, and many of them being from areas that had been bombed by Russian military jets. When the Ukrainian children heard the military jets, they wouldn't react like the Polish children. The Polish children would just keep playing, but the Ukrainian children would hit the deck. They would lay down on the floor. They would be shaking. And then when the plane passed overhead and finally went away, they would stop shaking, stand back up, and return to play. Because that's what they had been taught to do. You hear the jets. If you hear the missiles, get down. And now that's ingrained in them. Hopefully with time, they say time heals everything. Hopefully with time, this will fade from the children. But there'll be hints of this. There'll be parts of this that stick with them for the rest of their lives. Jet planes and cruise missiles sound the same. Yeah, that's the problem. They do sound the same. And the problem is that sometimes I'm in areas where the Ukrainian military is often training fighter aircraft, or they operate fighter aircraft. Sometimes I'm in areas like that. And so it's very difficult for me to tell, because missiles also pass over that area sometimes. Sometimes it's hard for me to know if it's a missile or if it's Ukrainian aircraft training. Because the engine of a missile sounds basically the same as the engine of a jet. Depending on the type of missile, there can be slight differences, but it essentially sounds the same. Unless you know the very, very specific audio nuances, it's the same sound.